Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Irish whiskey tasting event for our special Presilium Private Wealth clients. We're grateful to be here with all of you. If you were invited to this event, then you are very important to us. Our life's work is to ensure that all of you reach your financial goals and have an amazing experience along the way. Every decision we make is made with your success in mind and drives us each and every day. As usual, we remain ready to take advantage of whatever the market and the world gives us next, actively working on your behalf each and every day. Also, thank you for all of the individuals and families that you have introduced to us over the past year. We have really enjoyed working with them and also giving them an amazing experience. Now, speaking of amazing experiences, please let me introduce you to Andrew Healy, who's going to guide us through our Irish whiskey tasting tonight. Andrew was born in Dublin, Ireland, and now lives in the Napa Valley. He has acted as a guide for Irish whiskey tasting since 2016 and recently spent 17 days in Ireland, where he managed to visit 12 different distilleries during that time. We have a wonderful tasting planned for you tonight as we journey around the island of Ireland with Andrew. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Jerry, thank you very much for the introduction there. And I want to thank you, both you and Brooke, for having me here as your host on, I suppose it's St. Patrick's week or in the middle of St. Patrick's season. So I'm wearing my green. I have to give credit to you. You are one of the first people I've hosted an event for who actually in person looks like all those wonderful photos you were showing in the advance as people were joining. So credit to you for being up to date on your profile pictures. So I'm going to give everybody, as we would say in Ireland, a big Céad Míle Fáilte. So that's 100,000 welcomes, and you are welcome to my bar here in the Napa Valley. Now, I suppose for a lot of people, there were positives that came out of the pandemic, and what you see behind me is one of those positives. So I decommissioned some bookcases that my wife used, and I recommissioned them to hold my selection of Irish whiskey. And we're going to go through 5 wonderful Irish whiskies over the next hour or so. I was lucky enough to put this flight, I suppose, of Irish whiskies together for the company who Presilium have hired to have me host this for you. So these are 5 whiskies that I love. They have all got great stories attached to them. And it's essentially, as Jerry had said, we're going to take you on a journey around the island. We're also going to take you through some different styles of whiskey. And as we go through this, I can't see, just so everyone knows, there's 80 of us here at my bar right now. I can't see anyone, whether you're on camera or off camera. And I know Brooke is kind of driving the bus on this one. So if anyone wants to ask any questions at any stage, please drop that into chat. I have the chat window open here. And if I miss any of that, Brooke, I'll ask you to kind of flag me or jump in and say, Andrew, somebody wants to ask a question. So today is to be a wonderful journey with an Irishman around Ireland with Irish whiskies. And we're going to do 5 whiskies. We're going to have a bit of fun. Brooke and Jerry kind of gave me free rein on this hour. They said, Andrew, it's not really about us and what we do. It's about you and celebrating our clients. And that's what we wanted to do. So I've got a number of items that I've added into the presentation that I wouldn't normally cover. So we're going to look at a bit of Irish whiskey history. We will look at some whiskey production. We'll talk about rye whiskey, a new Irish whiskey that came out from one of the brands last year. So we'll talk about that. And we might even go down a little bit of a cocktail making rabbit hole as well when we talk about that. So if anyone's got any questions at any stage, feel free to raise your hand, pop it in chat, and I will do my best to answer your questions. We'll also do a little bit of trivia after each whiskey, just for a bit of fun. We all think we know everything, and the truth is we don't. So there's a little bit of trivia in there about some geography in Ireland, maybe a little bit about St. Patrick himself, a little bit about the size of the island as well. So you'll all walk away from this event with, I suppose, a new insight into Ireland and a fresh look at some Irish whiskies. Now, what I would say to you up front, I'm based out here in California. I am a California certified responsible beverage server. So to get my business insurance, I carry liquor liability insurance. A part of that is doing the state rules in terms of service. Now, you all have got your lovely little pack in front of you. You've all got your 5 1-ounce pours of whiskey. So when we start doing the math on this, we've got 5 1-ounce pours is obviously 5 ounces. That equates to about 1/5 of a full bottle of whiskey, about 20% of a bottle of whiskey. So I would encourage you to sip these over the course of the next hour or so. And actually, something that's fun to do is to come back and visit them again afterwards and see how they evolved in the glass. So I would encourage you, when we're going through these, to not pour the full little mini bottle into your glass and polish it off as we move through. Some of you are in Eastern time, so it's almost 6:10 where you are. Some of you are like me out here on the West Coast, where it's 3:10 and the sun is finally shining. So I just encourage you to kind of pace yourselves as we go through these whiskies, and we will taste them. So with that, I'm going to jump into my presentation here, and as Jerry has already done, he's introduced me. So I come from the village of Kiltiernan, which is on the south side of Dublin. And I now live here in the Napa Valley. And I've had I say 33, 34-year journey since I left culinary school. And no surprise, I ended up in the Napa Valley because of wine. So I have worked in and around wine for pretty much all of my working life. But in 2016, I started to take a journey into Irish whiskey. It's had a resurgence, and there's a lot of wonderful work being done back on the island. And as Jerry touched on, I was lucky enough to go back last May, borrow mum and dad's car and go off on a pretty magical road trip and visit a dozen distilleries over my 17 days there. So got to really get under the skin of what's happening. My journey is catalogued, I suppose, online at Irish Whiskey Lad. Obviously no longer a lad, being in my 50s now, but the LAD is an acronym for lover and drinker. So for those of you that want to follow my journey, that is where you'll find me. Now, for those of you that have been to Ireland, and if any of you have been to Ireland, please drop in the chat, where you've been and maybe some of the highlights of your visit there. But you'll know that we're famed for our hospitality, and we like to get a drink into people's hands. So what I'm going to suggest we do is we get some of our Teeling small batch. So that's what the full-size bottle of that looks like. I can also do the split screen here on that. So I'm going to join you with a little bottle, but that's what the full-size bottle of Teeling small batch looks like. And then we'll go through a little bit of background and history and production while we have a little bit of that in our glass. So let's get some of that into our glass now, and we'll raise a glass in a second. So I'm here at the bar. I've got some Teeling in my glass. So I'm going to raise a glass to everyone. I'm going to say Sláinte, to your health. Cheers, Santé, salute. So we'll have a little sip of that. And then we'll go through a little bit of background, and we'll come back to actually how to taste the whiskies as we go through. So bear with me as we do that bit of background while you have a little bit of that in your glass. So we're going to talk a little bit of history first. Let me go full screen on that one. So us and our Scottish cousins have a lot of back and forth banter about who actually invented or created whiskey. Truth be told, distillation was happening all over Europe up until way before 1324, when the first written records of whiskey production were written down. So a lot of European cultures have a distillation history. So aquavitae is a term some of you may have heard. We use the term ishkabaha, which translates to the water of life. But aquavitae is another term. And again, that all traces its history to a lot of distillation was done by monks back in the day, and a lot of it was used for medicinal purposes. Hence the term aquavitae or ishkabaha, or the water of life. So a lot of this distilled spirit was used for medicinal purposes. So back in 1324, there is, as I say, the first written record of whiskey, and I suppose a recipe for whiskey production, and that is in Ireland. We go forward a few hundred years, and the reason we have 1661 as an important date, obviously we were ruled by the British at that time, so taxed by the crown. Back in those days, literally every household in Ireland had a still, a small still, which they would distill whatever they grew on their land. And in 1661, as we know, here we are in 2024, we know that we pay sales tax, there's duty, there's different prices in different states. Liquor, hard alcohol is, a big tax revenue still, hundreds of years later, for governments, be they, county, local, regional, state, etc. So the British decided that they were going to tax the production of spirit, and essentially the at-home distillation that happened in Ireland was made illegal. So that's why 1661 is a big date on that. We fast forward to 1785, when they again decided to tax the production of whiskey on malted barley. So when we get to our last two whiskies, the single pot still whiskies, the Green Spot and the Redbreast, they trace their origins to 1785, when the Irish, as I suppose as a way to get around paying all the tax on the malted barley, was to actually use unmalted barley in the production of their whiskey. So we'll get to that in a bit. And then the late 1800s was when Irish whiskey boomed. So this image you see here is from the World's Fair in Chicago, and I believe it was 1893. Irish whiskey was booming. So for those of you that know and love your wine, you'll know that there was a louse called phylloxera that had ravaged Europe. So the cognac and Armagnac and brandy production fell away, and Irish whiskey filled that void. And being, again, part of the British Empire, Irish whiskey was exported to all four corners of the globe, and Irish whiskey was the preeminent spirit on the planet. Fast forward again to, this one's going to make everyone here smile in the States. So the start of the decline, the early 1900s. Obviously, this is a picture from Prohibition. We also had the First World War around this time. The Irish decided they'd had enough, and in Easter of 1916, we rebelled against the British. And it was essentially the start of the decline of Irish whiskey. On top of that, our Scottish cousins had started to produce blended whiskies using a more efficient distillation process, and they were starting to chip away at Ireland's, I suppose, role on the throne of whiskey production. Now, dates: 1835. There was 93 distilleries. By the time we got to the late 1800s, there was only 22, but they were big distilleries. When I graduated culinary school in 1990, there was 3 distilleries on the island, and as of today, there are 50-ish working distilleries. So Irish whiskey is definitely having a resurgence. Very quickly, let's just run through production here so that folks can get a little bit of a background on that. So we prepare the cereal grains, as I touched on already, malted, unmalted barley. We're also going to talk about corn and rye as we go through this session. So those cereals are prepared, and essentially they're turned into a soupy mixture. That's to help convert the starches that exist in these grains to sugar, so that they can go into the next process, which is fermentation. So essentially what we start out by doing in whiskey production is we essentially make a kind of an unhopped beer. That's about the best way to describe it. At this stage, the liquid is about 8% ABV or 16 proof. And then what we do is we drain off that liquid. It goes into the still and gets distilled once gets it to about 28%. The second distillation gets it up into the 50s, and the third distillation gets it into the 70s on the ABV front. And essentially what we're doing every time there is we are taking the ethanol away from the water. So alcohol or ethanol boils at a lower temperature than water. So that's essentially what distillation is doing. They heat up the soupy mixture, and the alcohol comes off, it goes into a condenser, but the water stays there. So every time you are taking more and more of the alcohol out. So as I said, triple distilled whiskies will be up in around the 70%, 140 proof. And then they are either slightly watered down or cut at that stage. And then they're put into barrels. So that's essentially the next part of the process. They're aged. So in Ireland, we had a history until about the late 1950s or 1960s where we aged a lot of our whiskies in barrels from Europe. So they would have been aged in barrels from Jerez in southern Spain. So ex-sherry barrels, ex-port barrels from Portugal, Madeira barrels from the Madeira Islands, Marsala from Sicily. Because back in those days, those fortified wines were shipped to Ireland with the liquid in the barrel. And then when the barrel got there, they thought, what will we do with it? We'll age some whiskey in it. As of the late 50s, early 60s, we started to see ex-bourbon barrels come into Irish whiskey aging. So now about 95% or so of all Irish whiskey is actually aged in ex-bourbon barrels. For those of you that know and love your American whiskeys, you'll know that bourbon can only go into the barrel once. It's called a first fill. And after that liquid is taken out and bottled, that barrel can no longer legally be used in bourbon production. So they go to Japan, they go to Canada, they go to Scotland, they go to Ireland, and they have still an awful lot of life left in them. They're used maybe 3, 4, 5 times in Ireland for whiskey production, and then they get a third life. They often will go off to the Caribbean and be used in rum production. At that stage, they're almost neutral, but they have a load of flavor in the wood from initially the bourbon, and then secondly, whatever whiskey followed that in. Some of them also end up in Mexico in tequila production as well. So there is this whole world of barrels literally being moved from spirit production area to spirit production area. And then lastly, the last area of production obviously is putting it in bottle, and what we're doing today is we're emptying a few bottles. So that is it's production in a nutshell. And if anybody's got any questions on that, please feel free to ask them, and I will do my best.
You, Andrew, have our first initial question from our good friend Becky. She was wondering, why did the number drop so dramatically for the distilleries down to 3 in 1990?
So essentially, so that's kind of the history there. You could see it. Our golden age was in the late 1800s. We had a kind of a coming together of all these events. First World War, Second World War, Prohibition. Prohibition was the big one. I'm going to say more than half of Irish whiskey that was made in the 19 teens came to America. Irish whiskey was considered a premium product. And when the American market was taken away in 1919, that literally was, where does half the production go? And it couldn't be filled in other markets. The other thing that a lot of people don't talk about is the Scots did a great job with blended whiskey. So blended whiskey was not something that the Irish did 110 years ago. We did single pot still, and we'll talk about that later. And the single pot still style is very rich. It's very oily. It's very heavy. A lot of people love it, but consumers 110 years ago were looking for lighter, fresher styles. And our friends in Scotland nailed that with blended whiskies. These were younger, fresher, lighter whiskies. And that was ultimately, if you can't sell your product, you're going to go out of business. So there's stories of, back in the day, there was, I'm going to say at its peak, 8 or 9 distilleries in Dublin. The last one closed in 1976 when everything moved down to County Cork, and we'll talk about Middleton later. Essentially, Ireland, I suppose, being frank about it, was stuck in its ways, was obsessed with single pot still, while flavors were changing. Look at the 1930s and the first coming of the cocktail boom. You wanted lighter styles of spirit that would go into those cocktails, and single pot still Irish whiskey was not a lighter style. We add in the Second World War. We had a trade war with the British when we finally got our independence from them, and that took away all of the empire. So no India, no Australia, no South Africa. None of the old British Empire countries were open to Ireland to export. So it was just a coming together, Becky, I suppose, of 5 or 6 or 7 different things all happening just one after another. And literally, when I was growing up in Ireland, there was Jameson, there was Bushmills, there was Paddy, there was Powers, and there was Tullamore Dew. And that literally was what you would see in the pubs in the 80s and 90s and into the early 90s. There was no innovation, no new fun things happening. So yeah, that's kind of how we got to where we got to, which was nearly extinction. We have our friends at Jameson to thank for saving Irish whiskey. They did a great job of marketing it around the world in the 80s, the 90s, and the noughties, and now everyone rides on the coattails of it. Here in America, 85% of Irish whiskey that's sold is Jameson, so everyone is fighting over the other 15%. And America is still the largest single country export market for Irish whiskey on the planet. So I hope that answered the question for Becky. If you need any more clarifications, please let us know. What we're going to do now is jump into, we've all had a sip or two or three on the Teeling small batch that we have in our glass, but I'm just going to show you how to actually taste whiskey as opposed to drinking it. So again, those of you that love your wine will know that when it comes to wine tasting, you pour the wine in your glass, you give it a bit of a swirl, you might put your nose to it and pick out some of those characters and then take it into your mouth. Some of you might hold it there for a second or two, maybe even pull in a little bit of air into your mouth and then either swallow it or, as I would have done in the past, spit it out when we're tasting lots of wine. So that's how we do wine. But whiskey's different. We're dealing with the elevated alcohol here. We're up at 40% plus, 80 proof plus. The Teeling small batch weighs in at 46%, so 92 proof. So, there's alcohol in this and we have to be careful. Jerry and Brooke are delighted to have you here. But they don't want to bill from your ear, nose and throat specialist tomorrow because you took too big of a whiff or nose of the whiskey. So we just treat whiskey when we're tasting it with a little bit of care. And that starts with rolling it in the glass. So let me just split the screen on this one so I can show you. So what does roll, don't swirl mean? So when you have it in your glass, whether it's a tasting glass like this or a tumbler glass, just kind of let it coat the glass, and it just gets more of the whiskey onto the glass. It just agitates it a little and gets a little bit of air through it. And then the gentle inhale there that I mentioned. So just kind of gently under the nose, back and forth, and you pick up some of those lovely characters. Now, when you take it into your mouth, you might have seen me doing this. When I raised my glass to you a couple of minutes ago, I hold it in my mouth for a few seconds. I kind of let it wash all over my tongue, into my gums. Our sweet receptors are on the back of our tongue and the back sides of our tongue. And a lot of the flavors and characters that we pick up in a whiskey are sweet characters. They can be spicy characters, but they can be sweet spice characters, but often a lot of sweetness. So when you drink whiskey, it tends to just go straight over that part of your tongue. So that's why I hold it in my mouth for a few seconds and just let the flavors kind of swirl around and wash around. I don't breathe in when the whiskey's in my mouth, so I will swallow what I have, and then I will breathe in through my nose, out through my mouth, or vice versa. It works differently for everybody. And I just let that air kind of wash over my tongue, and it accentuates the residue of the whiskey that's on my tongue. And we have some water. I believe everyone was sent a little water dropper in your kit. And our first whiskey is actually a great one to demonstrate how a few drops of water will kind of mellow or tamp down what some people might be experiencing in this whiskey at 46% is a little bit of a burn or a little bit of heat or a little bit of an alcoholic prickle, as I call it. So the few drops of water will help with that. So let me just demonstrate again how I taste the whiskey. So just hold it in my mouth there, and I'm in through my nose and then out through my mouth. And I do pick up a little bit of as I say, everyone's got a different term for it, whether it's heat or a burn or a little bit of a prickle on this. I love that because what it allows me to do is decide if I want to put in the water to to tone that down. So what I'm going to suggest people do, if they want to give that a try, is take the dropper. I'm going to pop in 2, 3, 4, 5 little drops of water in that. I use distilled water, no surprise. And I actually have been distilling my own water here in the house for quite a while. I got tired of buying those big plastic jugs and containers. And we use distilled water in our ice cubes as well. So whether we're making 1 ice cubes for shaking and serving, or big 2-inch cubes for I'll often have my last whiskey of the evening over a big 2-inch cube. I make them with distilled water. I just believe in respecting the art and craft of the distillers and blenders by using distilled water when you're using ice around good spirits. So with that one, so for me, softer in the mouth with those few drops. The prickle is gone. To me, there's a lovely creamy softness. The sweetness in there for me is kind of headed towards the stone fruit part of the spectrum. And that's what we're going to talk about next. And I believe Jerry and Brooke sent out ahead of time a whiskey aroma wheel, a flavor and aroma wheel for everyone to have a look at. So what this does is it just breaks nicely down where the different flavors and characters in whiskey come from. So, all that spice will generally come from the barrels, but it will sometimes come from, we'll get to it with our single pot stills, it often comes again from the distillation process. And that fruity character, where does that come from? That actually comes from the earlier part of the production process when we're making that soupy mixture that I talk about. That's where a lot of those fruit characters come from. And then we don't really find much in the way of, around here about 3 o'clock on the wheel here, we don't really find a lot of kind of red berried or dried fruits in this whiskey, but we will come across some of those in the later whiskeys. And I don't have a sensitive enough nose to kind of get into the floral section, but lighter styles of Irish whiskey and Japanese whiskey in particular, you find lovely floral characters. Grassiness tends to come from, I don't really find that a lot in Irish whiskies. I find that grassy character more in bourbons. But yeah, you have this lovely flavor wheel and use it to guide you as you are tasting. And one of the things I love about tasting whiskeys with a group of people, there's 90 of us here now. We're all going to taste something slightly different. So all of those flavors and aromas that we grew up with, wherever we grew up, whether we've moved like me to somewhere new. So, you'll often hear people use a term, it smells like the forest floor character. Well, a forest floor in Northern California is very different to a forest floor in County Wicklow. So for me, that character is a kind of a brushy, piney character here. And it's actually a kind of a wet kind of oak leaf character in Ireland, because the forests are very different. We all grew up in different homes where we were exposed to different cuisines and different ways to cook, whether it was, in your family home, in your grandmother's home, in your neighbor's home. So we've all got different flavor spectrums on that as well. A great example of that for me is I didn't grow up around maple syrup. It just wasn't something we had in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. Whereas here, maple syrup is pretty common on pancakes, etc. The baking that I grew up with was very different from the breads that are baked here. So we've all got this different flavor, I suppose, spectrum. So none of your tasting notes are wrong. None of what you're going to say in terms of what flavors you're thinking are in there are wrong. So just trust your brain and what's in there. And that will work. So what we're tasting, these are the 5 that we're tasting. This is them in all their full bottle glory. And we will work our way through these in a second. So this is the first one that we have in the glass. We've tasted it. I'm going to suspect some of you at this stage have possibly almost emptied your glass. But we're going to just give you a bit of background on this whiskey. And I'll go half screen on this one. So this is the Teeling Small Batch, 46 ABV and 92 proof. We have a wonderful phrase in this house. So we have something we call Tuesday night wine. We also have Tuesday night whiskey. And for us, that's a term we use for a not cheap but not expensive bottle of whiskey or wine that you would open on a Tuesday night or a Wednesday night. This is my wife's Tuesday night whiskey. She loves this whiskey. She loves the sweet finish on the end of it. And the next whiskey we're going to taste is my Tuesday night whiskey. So the background on this is from Teeling Distillery, a Dublin distillery. That's where I'm from. So the map pin there shows you where Dublin is on the east coast of Ireland. This is a mash or mash bill made of malted barley and grain whiskey. And our grain whiskey in Ireland is generally made from corn. So again, for those of you that love your bourbons, corn is the base of bourbon. To be a bourbon, it has to be 51% bourbon to be legally called bourbon. So we've used corn, corn as an ingredient in Ireland since the late 1800s or so. Now, we don't actually grow any corn in Ireland. We don't have the climate. Again, those of you that have been there will agree with me on that one. Our corn comes from France and from the Ukraine. That's where a lot of the corn comes from. And basically every blended whiskey that you see in Ireland, so, you know, like I said, those big names, Jameson, the Teeling Small Batch, some of the lower offerings, priced offerings, the entry point offerings from Bushmills, they will have some grain whiskey in it. It's a workhorse whiskey. Grain whiskey on its own, when it has aged, is an absolute delight to taste. A lot of people, I suppose, diss grain or corn-based whiskey because they think it's, you know, it's cheap and it's made economically, but it actually brings a lot of character to whiskeys. And the malt part of this brings some of that kind of, you know, bready character, little hints of spice as well. And when I say malt, I'm referring to malted barley. So we'll get to the single pot stills shortly, where we'll talk about malted barley and unmalted barley. And funnily enough, this is aged in ex-bourbon barrels, but it's actually finished in rum casks or rum barrels that come from Panama, if you can believe that. So you get a kind of a lovely sweetness on the end of this one. So this is Teeling's entry point whiskey. We love it here in the house. It's one of the reasons I included it in this lineup. I just think for people who are newish to Irish whiskey and who maybe have bourbon as a point of reference, this is just a great starting point for folks. And Brooke, you have just appeared, so I suspect there's a question in my future.
A few questions. Relative to the snacks that you shared, should you be pairing those with specific whiskeys, or is that just throughout the evening?
So I went with kind of a breadth of snacks that I think go generally. So one of the things I've learned in my journey is whiskey and fat are items that go really well together. So if somebody's got, say, some of the mixed nuts there, nuts are generally fatty, but you've also got a little bit of saltiness in there. And I think kind of a saltiness or a kind of a saline type character goes really nicely with the elevated alcohol on whiskey. So those are kind of for general pairings. I did treat myself to that chocolate box that I think I sent you the details of from CHUAO. I always struggle with words that have got more vowels than consonants in it, so I'm not sure how I pronounce that one. So I laid them out here on the bar. So for those folks who did buy that, I actually put down the mint chocolate bar against this one, the Sprinkled Dreams, if you can see that one there, without trying it yet. So the crispy waffle cone, hazelnuts, and rainbow sprinkles, partly in milk chocolate. My mouth is watering as I read out that description. So I would give that a try with that chocolate. I'll do it in a second when you ask me the next question.
Yes, the second one is just if there's been any corn supply issues during or throughout the conflict in Ukraine.
Yes, there have been. One of the, I'm sure folks know that there was, not sure what the right term is, but there was a blockade of sorts in some of the Ukrainian ports. And actually that caused panic, obviously, for food issues throughout a lot of the world, but also for spirit production issues in a lot of the world. It's not just Ireland that uses corn. Other countries would use that corn for spirit. Obviously, food is much more important than whiskey when it comes to people living. But yes, there have been supply issues with that. As a result, I believe that there was a couple of spikes in those because they're commodities. So there was some price spikes in that. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing increases in whiskey prices generally. For those of you who enjoy whiskey, you'll have noticed not just Irish, but whiskeys across the board have risen in price over the last number of years. So, so yeah, if that answers that question, that's great. Brooke, any other questions, or is that just me done on those two?
Correct. Yep. No other questions at this time.
Brilliant. So for those of you that do have, you know, the lovely pack of chocolate, what I'm going to give you kind of a quick sidebar on how you should taste chocolate with whiskey. I believe, as I just said to Brooke there, I think fat, whether it's nuts, whether it's cheese, whether it's chocolate, go really well with the elevated alcohol in whiskeys. So this little bar has got three little rectangles on it. It actually they write something on these. This one says devour me, but I'm going to encourage you not to devour it. I'm going to encourage you to break off one of those squares, pop it in your mouth, and actually let it warm up in there for about 10 to 12 seconds. Essentially the amount of time it takes you to sing happy birthday all the way through. And what that does is that brings the chocolate to your body temperature. So more of the flavor in there, you'll actually be able to taste in your mouth, and then take a little sip of whiskey on top of the chocolate. This is fun to do with flavored chocolate like this, but also fun to do with some 70% chocolate as well. And if you can hunt down some single origin 70% chocolate, so maybe one that's come from Costa Rica, maybe one that's come from Tanzania or India, you know, the equatorial zone, they will have different flavors in the chocolates, and they are fun to try and pair with whiskey. So with that, I'm going to pop this in here, give it a slight bite. I'm going to let it warm up as I'm chatting with you. That is about 10 to 12 seconds. I feel like Phil Rosenthal when he gets something he really likes. That works for me. I hadn't tasted through these before together, and I really like how that tastes in my mouth. One of the things we try and do, excuse me one second. One of the things we like to do when we're pairing is to take one, the whiskey, plus one, the chocolate or the cheese, and put it together. And the answer you're looking for is 3. You're not looking for 1 + 1 = 2. You're looking to take the whole experience to another level. And I have to say that really works for me. The sweetness in the whiskey and the sweetness in the chocolate really come together nicely. If any of you have gone and got that pack, that's a fun combination for me. And it might be something you will add to your repertoire for this coming Sunday and a St. Patrick's celebration. And with that, we promised you some trivia. So we're going to do the first of these. The answers are A, B, and C. So I know I've got webinar chat open here, Brooke. I think there's also a Q&A section as well. So I'm going to ask people to pop in their answer, A, B, or C. So St. Patrick, who we celebrate on the 17th of March every year, was born in the year 387. So a long, long time before anyone wrote down the first reference to Irish whiskey. But where was St. Patrick born? Was he born in Ireland? Was he born in Scotland? Or was he born on the Isle of Man? So I'm going to let you guys answer your A, B, or C in there. Brooke, you have a better view on where these answers are being written than I do. So
Yep, we've got
you can let me know.
So a number of C's coming in.
Okay, I just popped open Q&A, so I can see that now. And we've no prizes for getting these right for people. Obviously, the prize is to be gathered here with all of us at the bar and be tasting through some fun Irish whiskies. So looks like predominantly B's and C's.
Yeah. Couple using potentially hometown knowledge to skirt the rules here, but.
And of course, we are making the assumption that nobody has got Google open in another window and they have plugged that in. And I popped open the Q&A here, so I've seen some of the questions. So Samantha, you've spent quite a bit of time in Dingle, in the beautiful kingdom of Kerry, a beautiful part of the world, and they have their own distillery now down there in Dingle, and highly respected and highly rated. If you get your hands on any Dingle whiskies, treasure them. They are very, very special. And we Todd has been twice, so you've been to that lovely part of the world, Limerick, Kenmare, Kilkenny, Dublin, and small towns. So you've seen a chunk of the country as well. I was lucky enough to work the year that I finished high school, I was lucky enough to work the summer in Kilkenny, and I have a huge soft spot for the, I suppose it's technically a city, because in Ireland, if you have a cathedral, you're a city in Kilkenny. So let me do the reveal on this one, and I'll get back to that in a second. So the answer is B. Good old St. Patrick was born in Scotland. Back in those days, he was captured by pirates. He was brought to the north of Ireland, where he was put into, I suppose, servitude was the term that we would use, as a sheep herder, a sheep farmer, but he managed to escape, went back to Scotland. Obviously, no ferries in those days, so I have no idea how he got back and forth across that part of the world. And had an epiphany and decided he would bring Christianity to the pagan Irish. So that's where the shamrock comes from. So the shamrock being three-leafed, and the leaf, each of those being to represent the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as they would say in the Catholic faith. So that's the story there on St. Patrick and why he's the patron saint. Technically, he has not been canonized, so I'm not sure how he gets away with calling himself a saint, but we're not going to let that get in the way of a good annual celebration. So so there's the answer on that one. And let me just see there. And Pearson Dawn, you're from Cork and living outside Philly. Cork is a wonderful part of the world. I'm a big fan of West Cork and Clonakilty and out to Castletown Bear, and lovely part of the world. And for those of you that go, the town of Kinsale is considered Ireland's foodie capital. Get yourselves down there if you are in that part of the world. Okay, let us move on to our second whiskey. And a bit of history in this one. So Powers Gold label. As I said, this is my Tuesday night whiskey. We'll talk a little bit about some of those images on screen there. So much so is it my Tuesday night whiskey that it's time for a refill. There's not a lot left in that bottle. Powers is a historic and iconic Dublin distillery that was founded in 1791 by James Power, and it's now made. So when we touched on back in the 70s, when the last distillery in Dublin closed down, that was the Powers distillery, closed down, and essentially Powers, Jameson, and the Cork Distilleries Company, who were the last three distilleries in Ireland in the 70s, got together as one, and they moved down to Middleton in County Cork, in East Cork. They built a new distillery. At the time, it was the largest distillery in the world. And that's where Powers is now made. So I touched on pot still as a style of whiskey in this. This, again, a blended whiskey, but 70% of this is pot still whiskey, and the remaining 30% of it is grain whiskey, which we've already touched on. Now, Powers have been famed through their history for innovation. We would call them, I suppose, progressive by today's standards. So back, the late 1800s, early 1900s, they did things like provided very affordable accommodation for their seasonal workers in Dublin. They would support a soccer team. So there was a league of industrial, so breweries and distilleries had this league of sporting. The Powers family were always considered to be big benefactors. They supported the arts. They were always very generous, both to their employees and to the community at large. But one of the things they're most famed for, so the next time any of you are on a train or on a plane and you get a little mini of any drink, you can thank the Powers family for inventing it. So we call it the baby Power or the mini, the airline size, the nip. There's all sorts of different expressions for it. And on these two images you see on the left here, the one on the far left is one of the original minis. And if you can look closely enough, you'll be able to see that it actually has a little corkscrew on the top of it there. So the thinking behind this was Powers is the largest selling Irish whiskey in Ireland, even to this day. But up until the 60s, it was always a single pot still style. So it was always just a little bit out of reach price-wise of the working man and woman. So what the Powers family did is they invented the mini so that everybody could enjoy at least a dram or two of their whiskey. So let's get lovely. Let's have it. So nose-wise from me on this, there's kind of fresh fruits, little hints of apple in there. I really enjoy how Powers taste. Little hints of kind of, little in the background there, some sweet spice, maybe some kind of cinnamon, some ground cinnamon in there. And then just spice to sweetness in there. Lovely kind of hint of vanilla that comes on at the end for me, which comes from the oak as well. As I said, I'm a massive fan of Powers.
Hey, Andrew, we've got another great question. If the whiskey's aged in barrels that have been used for other purposes, how do they consistently create the flavor or control the flavor?
Goodness, that is a wonderful question. And that's where the art of the blender comes into play. So that exists not just in Ireland, but also here in American whiskey production. So when you think of let's use a kind of a brand that most people will know here in the States, Buffalo Trace, a really great value bourbon. If you can buy it, it's really bizarre. It's only really available on the coasts, and they create scarcity in the center of the country, but sells here in Napa. And I was in my local liquor store yesterday, and they've got a floor stack of Buffalo Trace, $26 a bottle. So same thing exists. How do they create that consistency week in, month in, year out? They're dealing with different circumstances here in America. So where that's made down in the South, we all know you get really hot summers and sometimes very cold winters. So the spirit is essentially, think of a barrel like a lung. It's going in and out. So in the summer, the liquid is expanding into the barrel, and in the winter, it's coming out and it goes back and forth. That is essentially the art of blending. So they will have lots of different components, and it's essentially practice. That's the joy of a brand, is that we all expect when we open it, it's going to have the same flavor profile this year, next year, and the year after. So it comes down to the blending and having. John, you've just joined us. We are on to the second whiskey, which is Powers Gold Label, which is that one there. Let me just pop it up on screen for you. So yeah, that's the art of blending, is how they get the consistency in the brand. So I hope that answers the question. Let me. So yeah, would love to know if anyone has a preference in the first two. As I told you, the very first one, the Teeling Small Batch, is my wife's Tuesday night whiskey. The Powers Gold Label is my Tuesday night whiskey. So they are two faves in this house. And with that, we'll go on a quick tangent very briefly, just to talk, for those of you that love your cocktail making. We had an innovation last year. So the first ever 100% Irish rye was launched last year by Powers, going back to that bit of innovation that they are famed for. So launched last year. It's aged in all American oak, and unlike a pot still, that beautiful rounded still that you would often see with the neck and the column going from it, it's actually distilled in a column still, so a long straight up column, a very efficient way, and that's how a lot of the blended whiskies are made. And here's a bottle of Irish rye. Lovely whiskey, I think, for a cocktail base. It runs that spectrum from sweetness with lovely kind of marshmallow sweetness all the way through to cardamom and cinnamon, and some lovely black pepper in there. So for those of you that love your old fashions or Manhattans, or to me what should be rye based cocktails, we're not tasting that. That wasn't in your pack. That's just me letting you know about a new innovation, which I think is something. And there's a little. The Irish built Manhattan is a cocktail recipe that is a tip of the hat to the Irish, who came over 120 years ago, who built the tunnels and skyscrapers and bridges in Manhattan using the Powers Irish rye, and obviously some Italian vermouth as well, because we know that the Irish and the Italians in New York always got on like the proverbial house on fire. Speaking of house on fire and heat, the next bit of trivia for everyone to have a bit of fun with is the hottest recorded temperature in Ireland is, and again, you got three choices on this one, and we'll move on to our Bushmills 10-year-old next. Was it 29, just over 29 Celsius or 84 Fahrenheit? I decided to do it in both numbers. Was it answer B, just over 31 Celsius or centigrade, or just over 88 Fahrenheit? Or was it C, all the threes, 33.3, or was it 91.94? So give us an A, B, or C there in the chat, and we will get the Bushmills 10-year-old lined up in glass. Fantastic. Okay. Let me do the reveal on this one, and we'll. So there you go. 33.3, so 91 or 92 Fahrenheit here on this side of the pond. And it was recorded, we mentioned Kilkenny earlier on, it was recorded in Kilkenny Castle. And bizarrely enough, it was actually recorded in the late 1800s. That was the highest temperature ever achieved in Ireland was well over 100 years ago. Fantastic. Right, we're going to head up north in Ireland now. We're going to head up to Bushmills. So up there on the beautiful North Antrim coast. The Bushmills 10-year-old. So that's what the bottle looks like. And different whiskey. We're into a single malt here. So all of the mash bill on this is malted barley. So essentially, the barley is forced into, I suppose, a false germination process. And that allows for easier extraction of the starch. And that's why single malt is something you will see all over the world. We're now seeing a lot of great single malts here in America, but Japan is famed for them, obviously Scotland as well. And Bushmills has been doing this since 1608. Now, the actual distillery site where it currently is, if any of you have been there, was built in, I believe it was 1784. They've been distilling on that site, and near to many beautiful things, one of them being the Giant's Causeway, a very unusual geological formation up there. Also near to the wonderful Royal Portrush Golf Club, which hosted the British Open a number of years back and is doing again, I believe, in 2026. So this is the Bushmills 10-year-old. This is something I love tasting. To me, it's kind of the quintessential Irish single malt. So aged for 10 years in predominantly bourbon barrels, and just just a really, really nice. So let me just give it a quick taste of that. And I see a couple of comments in there. Yeah, like I said, the quintessential Irish single malt is a kind of people call it a malty character, but for me, it's more of a kind of a breadiness. And then you've got, again, spice. You got little hints of sweetness in there, but I pick up more spice on the single malt. Just a really, really nice sipper, I suppose. A single malt sipper would be the best way to put that one. So Matt, you're sharing, you were in Clare and Spiddle and Inishmore and Galway, all beautiful places out on the west of Ireland. Sorry, Clane, not Clare. And then Dublin. Obviously, most people fly into Dublin, where I'm from, but I always encourage people to get out and see the country. Galway is beautiful. Cork is beautiful. Get up to Belfast. I'm a big fan of Belfast in the north. And then, Jim, you talked about visiting Teeling in Dublin. They do a really good visitor experience there. And I'm not sure if you met John Teeling or not. John Teeling is a legend of Irish whiskey production. And yes, he is a teetotaler. He does not drink, but the man is an incredible business brain. And we have a lot to be thankful to him for. So, fantastic.
Got a couple good questions here in the meantime, too. How long should you wait for the added water to open up the whiskey?
It should be pretty immediate. That would be the answer on that one. And one thing I would encourage people to think about doing if they want to do that is to take a second glass or another receptacle, another glass of some sort. So, there's your glass with the whiskey in it. Pop in your water and go back and forth like this. Just kind of back and forth. So you're mixing the water in. And that will actually allow you two things. It'll get the chemical reaction between the water and the whiskey to happen. But then in the so-called empty glass, you can actually give that a really good nose because there's only the residue of the whiskey in there. So that's just something to think about if you want to really get into a whiskey.
And a great question from Samantha as well. Just for those perhaps looking to purchase one of these whiskeys, what would be your recommendation here in the States?
In terms of which one to buy?
I think, I guess asking more generally, are they all available for purchase?
Yeah. So we put this flight So we put this flight together so that it's broadly available. You'll find, I suppose the best recommendation across the country would be Total Wine. I believe they're in 32 states. So all of these are listed at Total Wine. Obviously, I'm a big proponent of, spending your money at your local liquor store. Again, most of these are available at local liquor stores. And I drove across the country a few weeks ago. I drove my son from Reno to Florida, and I stopped at way too many liquor stores across 8 states. And I can tell you that most of these are available in most of those stores. So, so that answers that one. We good on that?
Question from Mike. What is the ABV of the Bushmills?
Bushmills is, we could say on the floor, it's 40% or 80 proof. I wish they would lift it just 3%, 6%. I think would really lift the character in there. We're seeing more and more whiskey, both American and Irish, bottled at that higher ABV. And I think it's a good thing. I think it adds more character to what's in the glass, and it allows you to decide if you want to tamp it down or dilute it in some way. So that is that one. Let me, well, look, I'm just mindful of the time. So let me just get this one into people's glasses. This is Green Spot. This is our first single pot still Irish whiskey. So let's get some of that in. So Green Spot, and then the next whiskey that will come to, I'll pop that one up as well, Redbreast. These are the two single pot still styles that I talked about. So we've touched on that a few times. 100% single pot still. Historically, we used malted, unmalted barley, you know, going back to the malt tax of 1785. That's when we used unmalted barley. But we also used oats and rye in our mash bills and wheat as well. So historically, a single pot still Irish whiskey had generally, the majority of it was malted and unmalted, but it had other grains in there too. It has evolved to a modern format, which we have in front of us today, which is essentially malted barley and unmalted barley, and none of those other grains are being used in this or the Redbreast. But that's changing. There are people back in Ireland who are working with old heritage mash bills, and we're starting to see some really, really fun historic referenced single pot stills come out of Ireland. So you'll see Green Spot and Redbreast in most places. For me, Green Spot is just the giveaway when you put your nose in the glass is, and again, I talk about earlier on about flavors that I don't have referenced historically. Jolly Ranchers are not a thing in Ireland, but you put your nose in this and it's like sour apple Jolly Ranchers. I could probably spot this at, or nose this at 50 paces. It's just, that's the classic smell of Green Spot. Where the name comes from is back in the day, I touched on barrels coming in from Spain and Portugal and Madeira. They would come into Dublin. The fortified wine would be taken out and bottled by the wine merchant there. And then those beautiful empty barrels would then be filled with spirit from one of the Dublin distilleries, and they would then be aged by the wine merchant. And what they did is they daubed some green on the top of the barrel to denote the age of that. And you can see over my shoulder here, I've got some other green spots. There's also yellow, blue, and green. And essentially this one that we're tasting now is 7 to 9 years old. Blue Spot is 7-year-old, but cask strength. Yellow is 12 years old and red is 15. So back in the day, they literally would daub the end of the barrel with that. So as I say there, 100% single pot still, malted and unmalted barley. And there is this family, we call it the Spot family. So yeah, big fan. I think we're going to taste the Red Spot next to it. 2 single pot stills. The majority of the aging of this is done in bourbon barrels, ex-bourbon barrels, and there is a little bit of the sherry influence in that. So so that's Green Spot. Let me do one question, then we'll jump into Red Spot, and then we will think about wrapping this up. So Carrauntoohil, which is down in County Kerry, is the tallest mountain in Ireland. But how tall is it? Is it 3,407 feet? Is it 3,907 feet? Or is it 4,407 feet? So I'll give you a few seconds to pop your A, B's, and C's in there. And let me just... Nick, you have said Galway over everything. I wouldn't argue with you on that. I love Galway. I was there on the road trip that Jerry referenced earlier on last May. One of my close friends from growing up in Dublin lives just north of Galway in a tiny little village, literally a one-horse village with the dry stone walls. And there's the pub in the village is also, the shop, the undertakers, that kind of, cliched Irish pub. I love Galway. Galway City is just a fun place to go. There are some absolutely fantastic pubs, some great restaurants. Down the road is Salt Hill, where there is Mickle Distillery, and they are doing some seriously fun things with their whiskies. So even though I'm from Dublin and I love Dublin, Galway is a very special place Can't argue with you on that one. So there's the answer. The tallest mountain in Ireland is 3,407 feet. And I'm going to guess that some of you live in parts of America where you're possibly even at that elevation. And that's how tall it gets in Ireland. So there's a little bit of trivia for you. Before we jump into the last one, which is some Redbreast. Redbreast 12. Let me get that in the glass. And what might be fun for you to do is to maybe have the green spot in one glass and the red breast in the other. Both single pot stills, but very different. For me, on the Redbreast, we have so more ex sherry barrels are used in this. So and they're sweet sherry barrels. So you have this lovely kind of spicy dried fruit. Think kind of sultanas and raisins and that sort of character on this. This is my gateway Irish whiskey. This got me started back in 2016 on this journey. And there is, I suppose, a family of Redbreast as well. There's a 15, there's a 21, a 27, and there are lots of special editions of it too. A really fun whiskey to go exploring, and definitely my favorite, and still my favorite after all this time.
Question from our good friend Pierce. He was wondering if the green spot or Redbreast was from East Cork or Waterford.
So they're both made at the same distillery, which is in East Cork at Middleton. So they're originally Dublin whiskies back in the day. And, you know, when I said in late 60s, early 70s, when essentially Jameson Powers and the Cork Distillery Companies got together, everything moved to Middleton. So what's being made in Middleton right now is Jameson Powers, Redbreast, Green Spot, and there's an experimental distillery there as well called Method and Madness. They go through a lot of spirit in that part of the world. How they manage it all is a feat in science and engineering, but I just love the fact that they can make these very diverse and different whiskies in the one facilities. It really shows their attention to detail and how they respect the history of each of the whiskies. So if you're looking for, oh goodness, I love Redbreast. If you ever want to get in my good books, a glass of Redbreast will do the trick. And the Redbreast pays homage to the robin redbreast, which is one of those very unusual birds that actually winters in Ireland. It doesn't hibernate to warmer climes. It sticks around for those cold winters. Speaking of Waterford there, just touched on by the last question, we now have a distillery in Waterford called the Waterford Distillery. They are really, really kind of delving into single farm Irish whiskey. So they will take the batch of barley from one farm and they will, essentially it's a micro distillery, and they will work that all the way through the system and they will release it as a release from that one farm. So doing some really interesting work there. And then I believe it's West Waterford, there is the Blackwater Distillery. John, what's his name? Mull Ryan, doing a phenomenal job there with heritage mash bills. So small scale. Like I said at the start, we now have almost 50 or around 50 distilleries. So we could almost talk about every county around the island, and there's some people doing some seriously fun things there. So, Bert, any thoughts on tasting different varieties and side-by-side comparisons? When you say varieties, are we talking like a range of single malts or tasting 12, 15, 21? I think you've always got to be careful that you're not tasting apples with oranges, that you're comparing apples with apples. Irish whiskies of the year, a few years in a row. Yeah, but yeah, it's a fair thing to do, because we'll all find a favorite in there. We can't all like every whiskey. So yeah, I think that's worth doing. I prefer to do kind of all of the same style. So do a setup of, say, single pot still or single malt of a similar age. So maybe take Bushmills 12, Napogue Castle 12, and some Tyrconnell 12, and have them side by side, or different age expressions. Jeff, a quick description of the spots. Green spot, which we're having, is non-age statement, but between 7 and 9. The yellow spot, which is my favorite of them, is 12 years old, and is finished in Malaga barrels from the south of Spain. So it's got this beautiful orange sweetness on the end of it. I think caramelized orange and orange oil. Red Spot is 15-year-old. I have a bottle of it. I like it, but I love the yellow. And then Blue Spot is cask strength and 7 years old. So I believe it's 52%, 104 proof, give or take. If you're ever having any cask strength whiskies, definitely have some water to drop beside you, because you need to kind of tamp it down. Start with 3, then 5, then 8, then 10. Yeah, it's just a great way to do it. And then just released this week in Ireland, there was a Gold Spot 13-year-old released limited edition to pay homage to the history of all of the spots. So that's the spot family, if that makes any sense to you. Okay, I did see one question asked there. I think, Brooke, you're cleaning out the questions, which is great. Thank you. As you can tell, I'm passionate about my Irish whiskies. I could not do the same thing for you on Scotch. I think somebody asked about that. So Irish whiskey is my thing, but I do conduct tastings here, both virtually and in person. We do kind of a road trip around America in whiskies. That's a fun thing to do, because a lot of great distilleries are doing fun things across the country. Again, buy local if you're going to buy some American whiskey. But no, Scotch is a whole new learning sphere for me. So perfect. Are we good to go, or anything still to clear up, Brooke?
No, all set. I might follow up with you on a few questions, but I think we're in good shape.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was amazing. We all learned a lot, and your presentation was fantastic. I loved all the pictures, and hearing you describe each one of the whiskeys, you can tell how passionate you are about it. And thank you to you, our wonderful clients, for joining us tonight. We really enjoyed spending this time with you, and will continue to remain focused every day on reaching your goals. We have an important cybersecurity event planned for all of you tomorrow with Gary Rossi, the former chief of FBI's Undercover and Sensitive Operations Group. The event will be live on Zoom at 12 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, and we would love for all of you to join us. Thank you, everyone. Good night, and we look forward to talking with you soon.